welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, that show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world and the future and inspiring future creation. I'm Ira Pastor. I'm your health and longevity and aging ambassador along for this journey today. And I'm extremely excited about this episode. So a little background. Throughout recorded history, natural products, primarily those from the plant, fungal, and bacterial biocommunities, form the basis for most human health interventions. And especially in the 20th century, the majority of all the pharmaceuticals, biologic, consumer healthcare products that we still use and patients have used around the globe had their origins from such biodiversity, generating literally trillions of dollars of wealth over the 20th century for the modern pharmaceutical industry. However, there are many scientists out there that believe that we've really only scratched the surface with what the natural world and its range of organisms, which, from a health and wellness perspective, are in many ways far more advanced than we are as humans, has to teach us. There are a lot of new research disciplines, including inter-kingdom signaling, semio-chemical communication, not to mention all the activity with the microbiome and virome, that are really highlighting sort of a myriad of new ways that these complex, combinatorial, non-human biologic signals can affect the human genome for positive transitions in both health and wellness. Examples, in the 21st century, we see microbiome cocktails entering the clinic. We see living bioproducts. Most people are unaware that leeches, maggots, and helminths are all approved for human therapeutic use in the United States. Even the FDA's, the multi-component botanical drug guidelines created a few years ago, where in essence the plant itself becomes the drug as opposed to any purified synthetic chemical entity, are just a few examples of how sort of this combinatorial trend and this move away from sort of reductionist single magic bullet concept from the pharma industry are occurring. And diseases are complex, multifactorial, and our therapeutic interventions are going to become more so as well. Parallel to all of this, is this global reemergence of research activities in the area of psychedelic pharmacotherapeutics, primarily focusing on classic hallucinogens, many of which have their origins in nature, including psilocybin, ibogaine, ayahuasca, and DMT, not to mention work that's going on with LSD, MDMA, and so forth, to help contribute to a really greater understanding of the mind and ultimately help alleviate suffering and many of the unmet medical conditions involving the human mind. So today's guest, who is really positioned at the epicenter of both of these areas, and is going to take us further along these themes, is Dr. Dennis McKenna, famed ethnopharmacologist, pharmacognosist, lecturer, and author. With a master's degree in botany and doctoral work in the botanical sciences, which included pharmacologic, botanical, and chemical study of ayahuasca, yielding his dissertation, which was entitled Monoamine Oxidase Inhibitors in Amazonian Hallucinogenic Plants, which needless to say entailed extensive field work in the Peruvian, Colombian, and Brazilian Amazon. Dr. McKenna received postdoctoral training, fellowships at the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology at the National Institute of Mental Health, as well as the Department of Neurology at Stanford University School of Medicine. Over his career, Dr. McKenna has authored numerous scientific articles and books on natural product-derived medicines, including the 1,100-page plus Encyclopedia of Botanical Medicine, the desk reference for major herbal supplements, as well as on psychedelics, which included The Invisible Landscape, Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, and The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, about his and his late brother Terence's life and journeys together. Along with his brother Terence, he is one of the founding board members and director of ethnopharmacology at the Heffter Research Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that's concerned with the investigation of potential therapeutic uses of psychedelic medicines, whose recent clinical studies have focused on psilocybin-assisted treatment for both end-of-life anxiety and depression in cancer patients, as well as applications in alcohol and nicotine addiction. Dr. McKenna spent a number of years as senior lecturer at the Center for Spirituality and Healing, part of the Academic Health Center at the University of Minnesota. He's also a senior research scientist for the Natural Health Products Research Group at British Columbia Institute of Technology in the Vancouver area, and most recently formed the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, which we'll get into a little later on, which has a mission of reestablishing this fusion of philosophy and science that existed in sort of the pre-reductionist scientific era where, mind and consciousness were not seen as separate things, but as this inseparable part of nature and scientific investigation. So with all that being said, Dr. McKenna, thank you so much for joining us today. I understand you just had a long trip and really appreciate you being here with us.
Well, yes, thank you, Ira. It's a pleasure to be here. We've been planning this for a long time, so, I'm glad we finally come to it and don't have to reschedule again. I figured let's just do it.
Absolutely.
We can always follow up later. A couple of minor corrections. I was for a time a senior research scientist at the British Columbia Institute of Technology, but that was 10 years ago. That was from 2006 to 2008, and then I stepped away from that. I went back to Minnesota and resumed my teaching at the University of Minnesota in the Center for Spirituality and Healing. Now, just recently, I'm back in Canada, just having completed a move, which has completely turned my life upside down. You can see the boxes in my, well, it's not a pretty sight anyway, but I'm happy to be here again. And this time it's for good. It's for the long term. But things are in a bit of chaos. I don't have any academic affiliation in BC right now, but I think that will come along. We're working on a couple of long-term projects, one of which is the McKenna Academy, which we can talk about. The other thing I should mention is that Terrence and I have collaborated on these things, but he had nothing to do with the founding of the Heffter Research Institute. That's a whole other bunch of committed, passionate people. I was a founding board member. I still am, but I wasn't the main catalyst for founding that. It was actually Dave Nichols, who's a well-known medicinal chemist in the area of psychedelics. And it still exists, and it's still very active. And many of the things that we dreamed of when we founded it in 1992 have actually come to pass. We used to discuss what a sort of quixotic mission it was to actually bring psychedelics back into medicine, and that's what we wanted to fund, and that's what we wanted to do. Well, here we are, many years later, almost more than 2 decades later, but now it's happening. And I would like to think that the Hefter's mission had a lot to do with that, something to do with it anyway. And I'll just say, anybody that wants to look at what the Hefter's doing, sort of by default, we focused on psilocybin, while MAPS, our sister organization or brother organization, but much better funded and much better at PR than Heffter is, but they focused on MDMA. Mm-hmm. So if people want to look at the Heffter as a website, they can. It's HEFFTER.org, and there's a good amount of information there on ongoing research, who's on the board, et cetera, et cetera. So that could be informative for people.
Definitely, and we'll link to some of that on the site and the blog, so people will be able to get connected with all your previous and current initiatives. Before we get into sort of some of what you're doing now, let's just take a little step back. And typically, we open this show with giving our guests the floor to for those that don't know of you, just a little bit of the background. Now, needless to say, you have written books on this, so I don't intend you lecturing for hours on everything. But just a little bit of how you got interested in both science, ethnopharmacology, sort of the transition into psychedelic research, and just ultimately what brought you to this point.
Sure.
Maybe make the decision to go as opposed to end up a cardiologist.
Well, right. Well, my career has largely been one driven by passion and interest rather than a desire to, achieve recognition in a field, and sort of that have done so, but that's been kind of accidental as I just pursued the things that really turned me on. And I was a child of the 60s, as you know. My brother was 4 years older than I was, and a big influence, and we were both quite interested in psychedelics, and particularly DMT. DMT was for us like the holy grail of psychedelics, and we felt that was of a whole order of magnitude different compared to, say, LSD, which was also remarkable. That's what was around in those days. DMT was very, very rare. But once we discovered DMT, it was kind of a siren song. We felt that we had to pursue this very ubiquitous, actually, very widespread molecule in nature. And that's what led us to go to South America in 1971 in search of an obscure orally active Witoto hallucinogen called ukuhe. We didn't really understand at the time, and no one did, that ayahuasca is an orally active form of DMT. And to your listeners, what do you mean by orally active? I mean that DMT is not orally active if you just eat it. You have to smoke it, or you have to take it other than by mouth because of the enzymes in the gut that inactivate it, these monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And as it happened, ayahuasca is a concoction made from a plant that contains these beta carbolines that are strong MAO inhibitors, and an admixture plant that contains DMT. And there are a few of those, a couple of those that are used. But I didn't really get into the scientific. I would say our trip in 1971 had some interesting outcomes. Not what we planned at all, which is kind of when the best discoveries happened. And we've written about that in what some might call a misadventure, but no adventure that you go on where you learn something is really a misadventure. But we've written about it in this book, The Invisible Landscape, then my brother's memoir, True Hallucinations, and then my 2012 memoir, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. So people can read that. They can, the whole sordid history is out there. I didn't really get into this as a serious study until 10 years later. And 1981, after completing my master's at the University of Hawaii in botany and phytochemistry, but not about psychedelics. But in 1981, I started my PhD program at the University of British Columbia. And that was to investigate ayahuasca and ukuhe, this obscure hallucinogen, which, two orally active psychedelics, one with the mechanism fairly well defined, and the other one was a black box, not really known. So that was my work for my PhD, and it's just gone on from there. And then, as you said in your very kind profile, I ended up at NIH for 2 years, working in the laboratory of clinical pharmacology, and then at Stanford for another postdoc. So that was kind of my detour into the neurosciences in some ways. I've always been interested in natural products, but and psychedelics and combining these. So that was my initiation into neuroscience. Then I went into the corporate world for a while. I worked for a startup company after I finished my postdoc called Shaman Pharmaceuticals. You can tell by the name, it's basically ethnobotany driven drug discovery.
Know them well.
Lasted, yes, you know them well, I'm sure. Lasted with them about 2.5 years, and then kind of became disillusioned with their approach, and so I ended up working for Aveda for a while, the cosmetics company. which was not really my thing, but it was a chance to get back to the field. And they actually funded they funded some field work for me to go to Brazil, look for cosmetic ingredients, new cosmetic ingredients. Unbeknownst to them at the time, I was collaborating on a project which has since become known as the Ayahuasca Project, which was the first biomedical investigation of ayahuasca. And this was at the invitation of the UDV, one of the churches that use ayahuasca as a sacrament. So out of this Ayahuasca project, we published over the course of the next, we carried out the work in 1993. And then over the course of the rest of the decade, about 8 or 9 peer-reviewed papers appeared out of that. And I was just, as I often am, I was just a catalyst. I wasn't, you're a scientist, so you know that science is a team sport. And there are usually many very dedicated people working, and that was the case with the Ayahuasca Project. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, ayahuasca has just been a really important part of my life, both personally and professionally. I just returned. I mentioned that I just got back from Spain. I just returned from the World Ayahuasca Conference, which is an event put on by ICERS. It's a NGO, ICEERS, International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research, and Service. Amazing organization. And this is the 3rd ayahuasca forum that they've sponsored, that they've organized. And then it was incredible. There were 1,400 people at this event. There were almost 100 presenters, and it brought together, ayahuasca is very interesting because it's on the sociological level, it's a microcosm of all these issues, indigenous people, geopolitics, the legal issue, the medical issues, all of these things are coming together, and ayahuasca can form kind of a microcosm of what's going on with psychedelics now. It's being recognized, like some of these other psychedelics, mainly psilocybin, as potentially useful for treating trauma, intractable depression, various other kinds of things, cognitive deficits of all sorts. New and interesting research about harming, which is one of the components of ayahuasca, is now emerging. So, it's a very exciting place to be. At the same time, it's in this interesting gray area because ayahuasca is such a natural product. Right. You can't really produce a synthetic analog of ayahuasca. Sure. Although people have tried, but they're not really the same. Unlike psilocybin, which is the other psychedelic that's attracting all the attention, that can be synthesized. Doses can be precisely titrated. The FDA likes these kinds of drugs because they're pure compounds. Ayahuasca and other plant-based things are, technically they can be developed clinically, but it's a much tougher route to eventually getting them in the clinic. And ayahuasca is, so difficult to separate from its cultural context as well. So, I think that also introduced complication, because then you're talking about indigenous knowledge, property rights, the impact of global culture on these fragile traditional cultures. I mean, it's all there, it's all there to talk about. And so anyway.
It's really interesting because, you're pointing out, I was fortunate in the sense that in my own journey through pharma, let's say the last 30, 35 years, I was able, at certain points, to be on the periphery of some of these areas. I was involved in phytomedicinal products around the time that the FDA was creating their their botanical drug guidance in the mid 1990s. I had a little bit of experience with DEA and having to go get permits for certain standards and substances and so forth. But correct me if I'm wrong. I think in 2019, though, when you look at natural products on one hand and psychedelics on the other, although there's been waxing and waning as far as sort of the pharma industry's looked at it, right now is probably, the most ideal situation on both fronts for sort of the Venn diagram of where these things
exactly.
And I think
things are coming together. Yes.
Yeah, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're through the window. I mean, this isn't an area that's going to hide away anymore. It's here.
I don't think so. I think the horse has left the barn, and it's a good thing that it has, because as a person in this area, you're aware that there's basically a crisis in mental health care.
Sure.
Most of the medications that we have are, either ineffective or poorly effective. A lot of the, mental illnesses that seem to have increased in our society lately, probably because, everything is so messed up on the social level. So particularly things like trauma, the legacy of our foreign involvements and that sort of thing.
Sure.
There have been 2 movies that have come out just recently. One is, I think, already released. One is called Shock to Awe, or From Shock to Awe.
Yeah.
The other one is Ayahuasca Now. Both of these are movies about vets who have gone to, who basically where the Veterans Administration has failed them.
Right.
Vets with PTSD that have not really achieved any resolution for their problem with the sort of polypharmaceutical approach that the Veteran Administrations, offer. So they come to these retreats, and many of them within 1 or 2 sessions, basically their PTSD is, if not completely cured, at least reduced to the point where they can see a way out of it. Why this is not being looked at by, by the Defense Department, by our government as a potential solution is puzzling to me, and at the same time not surprising, because there's been this mindset all along that psychedelics are useless. They've been Schedule I drugs, can't possibly have any medical application. But now all that's changing. The context is changing. And as good science accumulates, people are realizing, yes, these may be the medications of the future.
Sure.
And for mental health problems, and I don't even think it's limited to that, because psychedelics, as some have articulated, psychedelics can be medicines for the well as well, or can be used as a means to explore consciousness and understand ourselves better. So we live in interesting times, I guess you could say, right at this moment.
Completely agree with that one.
As far as psychedelics are concerned.
What are you most, we spoke about, psilocybin work and fear of death, depression, with terminal cancer, obviously the ayahuasca work that you've been doing for a while. What are you, purely, I guess from a pure clinical perspective, what are you the most excited about that you think is going to sort of be the first major win, let's say? And
well, I think clearly, I don't think it's a race exactly, but I think that MAPS has MAPS, which Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, by far the bigger, better funded, and more visible of the nonprofits that are doing this work. They've kind of adopted MDMA, and they are touting MDMA as the answer for trauma, especially in vets and so on. So that's great. That's the wagon they've hitched to. Heffter is focusing more on psilocybin. It's not like we got together and agreed, you take that one, I'll take this one.
Right.
That's just the way it's fallen out. So Heffter is focusing on advancing psilocybin, clinically. Most of the researchers on psilocybin are being funded by Heffter. Many of the top researchers, such as Roland Griffiths, are on the board of Heffter. So we're kind of leading the charge to get psilocybin accepted as, as a treatment for different things. And the FDA, you have to be selective about the disorders you identify, that will convince the FDA to let it go forward. So they focused on intractable depression,
Okay.
And that does not make the FDA uncomfortable. They haven't focused on trauma. They haven't really focused on end-of-life anxiety, but I do think psilocybin has a future there. And I can see 5 years from now where people in hospice situations, will have the option for psilocybin-assisted therapy for essentially coming to terms with their mortality. And I think that's a great application.
Mm-hmm.
What dismays me a little bit is the fact that ayahuasca is sort of the bastard stepchild of all this. It's the one that's being neglected.
Yeah.
Although there's plenty of research going on, very little FDA approved research in the States, but in other countries, there's both basic research and clinical research with ayahuasca. And why I think it's important that ayahuasca gets more attention is because I think many people are coming to their first psychedelic experiences, which can be transformative through ayahuasca, sort of because of the myth and the romance of going to South America or seeking your old shaman. It's kind of harks back to the old teachings of Don Juan, legacy, which was largely fictional. But people are able to access rather transformative experiences through ayahuasca. And it's, there are many places in Peru and other countries that have these retreat centers people can go to. And there are also these kinds of centers operating more underground in the States. Although, again, I think even that is changing. Just in the news yesterday, I heard that the city of Oakland had decided to follow Denver's example and decriminalizing psilocybin, and I believe they also decriminalized ayahuasca in their pronouncements. So these are all good signs, and good signs that maybe medicine is taking a second look and saying, well, these things are not so dangerous. In fact, they can be quite helpful. I would like to see more work done with ayahuasca. I've always been an advocate, though, even in among my Heffter colleagues, I'm kind of a rebel.
Mm-hmm.
A rebel is not the right word, maybe a maverick. And I'm a maverick in the sense that, I think clinical trials are fine. And but I don't think that these traditional medicines should necessarily be co-opted by clinical medicine. They don't really fit in some ways. And ayahuasca particularly doesn't really fit in those kinds of treatment protocols. And I think, personally, I have, long held that if ayahuasca cannot be integrated into therapy in the States, that doesn't mean it can't be used. So do the work outside, do the work in places like Peru. Right. There are plenty of good clinicians in Peru. There's no reason good science cannot be done. And this is their legacy, and so I'd like to see that, more of that. And that has to do, that's why I decided to found this thing called the McKenna Academy. Mm-hmm. of natural philosophy. I'm not sure it'll stay that name, but provisionally. And the key of the key concept is that it will be a platform outside of the regulatory, constraints of the FDA and the DEA. It will happen in a country where ayahuasca is, not only legal, but allowed, recognized as a national patrimony. So that's one of the reasons to do it primarily there. And in other medicine-friendly countries as the laws change, which they are.
Yeah, it's 2019. I talk about this related to a lot of things. It's a globalized medical system of training and clinical practice. This isn't. I mean, I used to joke back when I was in pharma in the 80s. It was about the U.S. first, and then there was the rest of the world. But,
right.
I mean. And now, there's every country out there has some branch, whether it's Harvard University in Dubai or, Newcastle University in Malaysia. I mean, this is an integrated system, and we can't hide anymore that there's not good medicine occurring in Thailand or Turkey or Panama or elsewhere. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere, and I think in part that represents two things. It represents that medical practice has improved in those countries. Sure. And I think that medical practice in the States has suffered deficits over the last few years. And when it comes to ayahuasca, the fact that, or psychedelics in general, the fact that there are all these programs in all these countries happening, good science, it speaks to me of the, a lot of good investigators have wanted to get into this,
right.
And now the doors are open and the flood is forcing the doors open. So many dedicated therapists, clinicians, basic neuroscientists have all long wanted to focus on this, but it's been difficult because of the regulatory issues.
Sure.
So now that's changing. So I'm very happy to see that. I feel sometimes in my lectures, I say that ayahuasca in particular is medicine for the soul. If you believe in the soul, I think we all believe in some kind of soul. Well, we actually represent that, but I think it's medicine for the collective soul as well. Society is wounded. Society needs healing, and ayahuasca potentially could be the catalyst that brings that together, that makes that happen. So that's my own personal hope. And the idea of the McKenna Academy is that it will be a place of learning, a place where everyone can come with their good ideas, with their best ideas, and learn from each other, learn from the plants directly, develop new protocols, new understandings of what society should be, what compassion should be, and not incidentally, how to save nature.
Right.
It's interesting how so many people who come to take ayahuasca come back with this revelation about how we have to re-understand our relationship to nature because we're destroying it. And I think ayahuasca is a catalyst really for altering that perception or advancing that understanding, on a global scale.
Speaking of, about the Academy and some of your vision there, so I'm just borrowing a little bit from the publicly available material. You say, modern science grew out of natural philosophy, which is a fusion of philosophy and science that considers mind and consciousness as inseparable aspects of nature. Before modern science became fragmented into specialized disciplines and restricted to quantitative study, natural philosophy acknowledged the limitations of reductionism and embraced complementary ways of understanding derived from intuition, insight, and inspiration. It's such an elegant description of it. Walk us just a little bit through sort of what you envision. I mean, I know you've spoken in the past in some of different shows that you've been on about, obviously South America, but really, what this may look like ultimately in the coming years, what you envision as sort of as
Right.
the grander McKenna Academy structure gets up and going. What do you see?
Okay.
It's a truly fascinating mission, not just from the perspective of, you're saying, the studying of the substances, of ayahuasca and so forth, but at the same time, as you were saying, there's a bunch of people that are extremely interested in this, but don't always talk about it. At the same time, I see, and outside of this sphere, there's a bunch of people that are very interested in the reconnection of mind and consciousness with this, other scientific disciplines. They don't normally want to talk about it, but they will talk about it if, when they're not around.
Well, the idea of the academy is exactly that, to provide a place where people can talk about it, where the most brilliant minds that we can attract can come and share their knowledge and learn from each other. And it's not just a retreat center. I mean, my idea for the academy has a much broader scope. Mm-hmm. Retreats, certainly, that will be part of it. Training therapists, that will be part of it. Presenting courses, I want to develop courses like any good academy in these transdisciplinary fields, and hopefully in association with existing academic institutions like the University of British Columbia is one possibility. And also I want to organize impactful conferences that will have global impact in changing people's minds and understanding of nature. And, and combine, have a component for natural products research, especially drug discovery or using some of the existing plants in novel ways for therapeutically. People think maybe that there's nothing to be learned about the chemistry of ayahuasca. We worked that all out years ago. That's not really true. We're still learning from what I sometimes called hoary old alkaloids like harmine. It's been around since before ayahuasca was even reported to science, and now it turns out it's having, there's kind of a renaissance in taking a closer look. What does this interesting molecule do? Well, it's much more than just an MAO inhibitor. Right. Now we're finding it has its fingers in many pies by its modulation of different regulatory kinases, related to neurogenesis, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think there's work to be done there with things like these natural products. I mean, the beta carbolines have not been very seriously investigated, and that's a whole new area of natural products, extreme complexity that should be looked into. Sure. There is no and many of the plants, ayahuasca, interestingly, in its traditional context, exists in kind of a pharmacopoeia of associated plants. Some of these are used in the so-called dietas, which are traditional practices for shamans in training, if you will. Others are used by themselves. Many of them, the ethnographic reports indicate they may be psychedelic in themselves. But when it comes to the chemistry, they're very poorly studied. So there's a lot of potential for new psychedelic compounds coming from the natural world rather than being created in the laboratory. And either way is fine, but we shouldn't be neglecting, that this natural, because they're, those plants have a legacy of traditional knowledge. I mean, there is actually knowledge existing in how to use these things, and also the track record that they are safe, at least in the sense that people are using them and not dropping dead. So there's a measure of safety that may not exist with the synthetic compounds. So I think it's all good. I just think that discovery on all of these fronts, should continue. And Absolutely. The academy, the idea of being an academy is that, it's a place for the exploration of ideas and sharing of ideas. So, for example, I don't know if you know, you probably do, that I organized this conference in the UK in 2017 called the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs.
Okay.
And it was a commemorative 50th anniversary conference of the original conference in 1967, which was held in San Francisco, 1967, under the sponsorship of the National Institute of Mental Health. All the giants of the field, there weren't that many in those days, but they were there. This was a closed conference. The only thing the taxpayer ever got out of this was the symposium proceedings. It was, which the U.S. government printing office published for many years.
Wow.
That book fell into my hands at the age of 18, and I don't know how it did, but it was very influential to me. It really, it provided to me the perspective that there is science behind this, and
Sure.
In addition to the ethnographic connection, there's also the phytochemistry and the neuroscience and all this. And that was really influential in my decision to pursue a career in ethnopharmacology. And I've long wanted to do a commemorative symposium. Well, in 2017, we pulled it off.
Mm-hmm.
And we published a 2-volume set. We republished the 67 volume. It's in the public domain, and the new volume. It's been hailed. It's won a couple of awards, and unlike the first symposium, when we did it in 2017, we had Facebook live streaming available, so 75,000 people were able to watch some of those lectures. They're still up on the web. I can send you a link.
Sure.
People are free to watch them if they like.
Excellent.
And then there is the symposium volume that came out of it, and that's published by Synergetics Press. If you want me, people want to order it, they can do that.
I'll definitely have those links attached too.
Okay. So I mentioned this because it was an important conference, but it's also an example of the kinds of conferences that I would like to do under the umbrella of the McKenna Academy. In other words, important issues, bringing experts together, have the symposium, share it with the world through social media, and publish a volume, publish a product so that people can follow up on it. And that's much of that. So conferences as well as courses. I'm hoping to not resurrect, because it never went away. I'm hoping to, with the help of some colleagues at UBC, recreate a world-class program in ethnopharmacology, some of which would be taught in South America, and some probably at UBC or wherever the course is based.
Excellent.
So we have a big agenda, big ambitions, and hopefully it'll happen. This is the year to either manifest it or stop talking about it.
Related topics, I just wanted to get your top line on. One of them has to do with this phenomena I read about it more or less occurring on the U.S. West Coast in Silicon Valley, but it's this concept of microdosing of various hallucinogenic substances. In many ways, I guess, and once again, correct me, sort of separating the visionary component from some other neuropharmacologic effect for creativity and other purposes. What do you think about this trend in terms of this? It's neurobiohacking. Is it possible to separate these two things, do you think, or are you losing something? What's your opinion on this sort of space?
Well, I think yes, and yes to all of the above. I think that a microdosing is fine. I think that's another way of exploring, what these compounds might be useful for, cognition enhancement, and that sort of thing. I think that people should not forget that, at higher doses, they get much more interesting. So well, I guess if I have a criticism of microdosing, it would be that, are people retreating into microdosing because then they can say, they're into psychedelics, but actually lack the courage to take that heroic dose and find out what are they really about.
Right.
And I think everyone who wants to microdose should take on occasion a larger dose just to remind themselves what they're dealing with.
Sure.
So I think that's important. But again, microdosing is one of these areas where there's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of talk, there's not much research. And there needs to be more research, because why shouldn't these things be effective at lower doses?
Absolutely.
There's one issue about microdosing that does concern me that is not being talked about very much, and that specifically is about microdosing with LSD.
Right.
And that's one of the more popular ones to microdose. There's reason to believe that long-term use of LSD, even in chronic use, regular daily or every other day use with LSD, may be hazardous because of its activation of the 5-HT1B receptor. It works mainly on the 1A receptor, but it activates the 1B. Is it the 1B or the 2B? I think it's the 1. You know this. You know what I'm talking about, right? This cardiac pathology that may be associated with it. And it has to do with the unique way that LSD binds into the receptor in such a way that part of the receptor folds over it. So it, prolongs the half-life. Essentially, it can't easily dissociate. And so you get this constant agonist activation of the 1B receptor. There were serotonergic drugs on the market in the late 90s that were taken off the market because they caused this I can't even say it, proliferation of this valvular tissue, which was irreversible. The only way it can be corrected is through a valve transplant. I think people should be cautious about microdosing with LSD for this reason.
Sure.
There's literature on this, and if you go to the Heffter.org, if you look at the blog, there is a section there that discusses this possible hazard. I think that with psilocybin or MDMA or these, especially psilocybin, you're not really facing those issues. It binds in a different way. It has a lower affinity, and it's probably much safer if you're going to microdose.
Gotcha. What you routinely will speak of plants as teachers and sort of listening to the plants. In 2019, is cannabis a plant that, on the scale of all the thousands of plants that you've studied, a plant that we should be listening to more or less? In this scheme of everything that you've worked on, of all that you've studied throughout your career, obviously you see everything that's going on with it in the U.S. and abroad, and recreational use, medical use, and so forth. What's your opinion on cannabis, just in general? And what's happening?
I think cannabis is great. I think that it is one of the more benevolent medicines that nature has given us, and it has potentially broad application, and it is, as plant medicines go, I think it's quite benign, and I mean, obviously with any drug, there are side effects, there are issues, but with a little common sense, I think cannabis can be quite beneficial. And I again, cannabis and ayahuasca, these two plants are good examples. Sometimes in my talks, I say, the plants are running things, and it really is true if you think about it, because they're sustaining life on Earth. But on the sociological level, it's interesting how, it's like ayahuasca has emerged out of the jungle to take center stage to transmit this message, which I say is a transmission from the community of sentient species. And cannabis, much the same way. I mean, it's like, for years, all this controversy about should cannabis be legalized, should it be regulated, should it be, and then within just a couple of years, the whole societal dialogue about cannabis has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to feel that that's probably beneficial. Ultimately it's beneficial. Because inherently, I mean, whether it's a recreational drug or a medical drug, cannabis is inherently much less harmful than, say, alcohol, which we know is harmful, and that's been the recreational drug in our society forever.
Right.
And it doesn't foster, it has toxicity, it causes behavioral problems, addictions, death, all of these things. Why shouldn't we, as a society, find a way to accept cannabis into our culture?
Absolutely.
We'll be a better culture because of it. Now, there's always the issue of the individual person that will misuse it or not really understand it, and there is an element of individual responsibility here.
Sure.
And there's an element of education.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe any drug should be prohibited, and particularly not any plant. That's my latest banner, is that, symbiosis with plants should be a fundamental human right.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, there are pitfalls, but prohibition has never worked. And
Right.
if you ban a plant, you only make people curious about it. The thing to do is educate people. You have cannabis. There are appropriate and inappropriate ways to use it. Same with ayahuasca. Same with any of these things. So again, education is the answer. People should use, if they're going to get involved with these things, they should understand what they're choosing to do is form a relationship with the substance, with the plant, whatever it is. And in the case of a plant, you can think of that as a kind of a symbiosis.
Mm-hmm.
Even a symbiosis can be harmful, but
Sure.
usually, I mean, in the right circumstances, they're more beneficial. So people, who make these choices should make them from an informed place,
Mm-hmm.
and regulate their own behavior. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect people to, sort of consciously be aware of how they relate with these substances.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a simple, it's kind of obvious. You would be careful about the people you form relationships. You should be careful about the plants or the drugs you form relationships.
Absolutely.
I've always said that the moral dimension in this comes from the heart. Sometimes I say there's no such thing as a bad drug, but plenty of bad ways to use drugs.
Sure.
And that's the difference. The behavioral component comes from humanity.
Right. No, I completely agree on that one.
Yeah.
But with that, and that leads into my last question before the wrap up, and that has to do with the use of some of these materials for addiction. For many years now, I followed the work of Deborah Mash down at University of Miami on Ibogaine. You've been involved with ayahuasca and addiction, I believe,
Right.
to some extent. Can you give us your top line thoughts? I mean, we clearly in this country alone have a major addiction problem, especially with the opiates and
Right.
other materials. And some of the clinical evidence that I saw when I looked at this stuff 15 years ago was, earth-shattering. Single doses of this stuff just, obliterating some of this addiction. Where are we nowadays with with this?
Well, again, this is, ibogaine, which is not the only psychedelic that can be used for addiction. There are now studies looking at psilocybin, opiate addiction, ayahuasca. Again, not formal studies in this country, but that's another one where people can often deal with their substance use problems, and so they all have potentially, this therapeutic application. And again, addiction is such a complex thing because it's so dependent on your social milieu, your will, your desire to quit. I mean, there is no panacea, and there's no drug, ibogaine, ayahuasca, LSD, psilocybin, that is going to cure addiction. I think that an important perception, something people have to understand, is no drug is going to cure your addiction. You are going to cure your addiction, right? The drug can open an opportunity, and I think that's the way these things work in addiction and many other things. This, neuroscientists talk about the disruption of this default mode network, which is temporary disruption, which is another way of saying it temporarily releases you from the box of your habits and your habitual behaviors. Addiction is very much about habitual behavior, and if you can disrupt that sort of habitual set of programmed behaviors that you built up around addiction, you can look at what you're doing from a fresh perspective, and you can say, oh, this is the dynamic here. This is what I need to change in order to get free of this addiction. But if you have that revelation, if you take ibogaine, go to a clinic and take ibogaine, you can you can get that insight. If you go back to your old neighborhood and start hanging out with your old friends and doing the same things you were doing before, it's not going to work for you. So you have to plan this thing. You have to say, I'm going to get ayahuasca therapy. I'm going to get ibogaine therapy. The question is, what do you do afterwards? How do you plan ahead so that you can take maximum advantage? The only thing that I think ibogaine does, that some of these other things don't, is particularly for opiate addiction, they just temporarily take away the craving. They give you a few days to a few weeks to kind of, get re-equilibrated, get reoriented. The others don't do that so much. Ibogaine there's something about its mechanism of action that prolongs this, I guess post-session glow phase. So that's very useful. You can plan, you can think more clearly if you don't have this monkey on your back all the time. I think they have great potential for addiction and all kinds of addictions. As a society, we're all addicted to something. It seems like, it's a society that holds forth many temptations. And it's not that you have to resist temptation. You can enjoy these things but it becomes self-destructive when that's what takes over your life, whether it's addiction to drugs, to alcohol, to television, to the internet, to sex, to, you name it. What the drugs what the psychedelic medicines enable you to do is to see it in perspective and take control so that it doesn't enslave you anymore.
Excellent. Well,
we've covered a lot of territory and probably not enough, but anyway, we can always do this again.
No, absolutely. I'm thinking of a lot of things we can continue to talk about, but I know you've had a long journey, and don't want to stress you too much at one time. But I did want to, before we wrap up, there is the science fiction question that everybody gets on this show at the end. It has to do with me putting you, Dr. Dennis McKenna, in my time machine over here and allowing you to travel to any time you want and to meet with somebody that you have from the past that that you might have wanted to speak to at some point and talk to them for a while, who would that be for you? And what would you want to talk to them about? You can take your time with that one to think through it.
I hate these kinds of
I
questions.
too. You have to,
I don't know. There are so many. I think
you can have a little round table, actually, if you want. You can pick a few and have dinner.
well, okay, if you're going to let me do a round table, I would say 3 people that would be on it for sure. One would be Albert Hoffman.
Okay.
One would be Albert Einstein.
Ooh.
And the third one would probably be C.G. Jung, just because that's my personal interest, but it would be, those 3 would be on it. I'd have to think about who else, but they've all been very influential in my world, just thinking about this area and thinking about the cosmos in general.
Sure.
Let's add Stephen Hawking into that, as long as we're at it.
I'll pull out some LSD and let it.
Right.
Start tripping.
You gotta think that somebody like Stephen Hawking has probably, been personally through the singularity, whether with the help of psychedelics or not. But I suspect perhaps he has. And Einstein probably not. Jung, who knows? But certainly, from the only thing that was available to him at the time was mescaline, but I can't believe that he did not take advantage of it if he knew about it. Much of his writing reflects that he was, well familiar with altered states. So those 3, that would be a good discussion.
Absolutely, I'd enjoy that one. I definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Dennis, it's really been a pleasure, and we will have links up to everything that you've published, what you're going to be doing, and really wishing you the best of luck with the new institute, and we'll definitely keep an eye on that. But for everybody, Dr. Dennis McKenna, founder of the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, ethnopharmacologist and pharmacognosist extraordinaire, Heffter Research Institute. We'll have links to everything, but once again, thank you.
I will send you a few links. The McKenna Academy at the moment is a concept in embryogenesis, I guess you could say. We don't even have a website up, but it will be soon. And the other links I could send you to the ESPD conference and the videos, and also to the Heffter and a few other things that you might find interesting. So okay. All right.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It's a real pleasure.
All the best to you. We'll look forward to the next time.